morning, I'm Joan Gore, and I am conducting interviews for the AIEA Digital Archive Project, which makes those of us who are participating in it, the word archive, sound very, very old. And we're not very, very old, but it is an interview program designed to talk with the people who have led the transformation of international education from the 1980s or so, some of us in the earlier 70s, to the present day. We're the second generation of leaders to have emerged after World War II. We did a digital archive at CIEE with that leadership, and AIEA has taken the mantle and is creating an archive for both research and other purposes of this generation. So I'm very pleased to have a very old man and a very old friend, Dr. Michael Woolf, who is Deputy President of CAPA, the Center for Academic Programs Abroad, really known as CAPA, and with whom I worked 25 or 30 years ago at CIEE. Michael is UK-based and is a man who's had a very diverse career and made contributions to the changes that have brought international education to where it is today for a very long time in many different capacities. Having said all those wonderful things, let's go back to when you were a young man and tell me a little bit, if you can remember.
Just about, yeah.
Right. A little bit about how you got into this field, because your academic degree is not in this area, and in fact, when we were young, it didn't exist as an academic degree.
I mean, that's the big difference.
Yeah.
You know, it was a field that nobody, you stumbled into it.
Exactly.
You didn't even plan to come into this. And I came in really totally by accident. I was skipping through my undergraduate work. I was at that point then studying American literature, and got a job in the University of Padova in Italy, and then moved on to the University of Venice. So I was in a very odd situation where as an Englishman teaching American literature to Italian undergraduates, and our capacity for confusion was huge. So out of that kind of interesting clash of different national attitudes, I got interested in the whole area of the intersection of nations and countries and what happens at that level of intersection. I spent 3 years in Italy, came back, stumbled into a job at the BBC, where again I was kind of
Really?
Oh yeah, I was a researcher and writer for some years at the BBC on documentary radio programs, and I was kind of earmarked to write stuff about international things, and then partly I was teaching also American literature at Middlesex, which was then Middlesex Polytechnic, and then somebody said, there's an organisation called CIEE that's looking for someone, and this is actually what they said to me, rest his soul, I remember him well, a man called Chris Brookman. He's looking for someone who's not very good at any specific thing, but knows a bit about a lot,
Everything.
and I've proposed you. And frankly, that's how it happened. I had various mysterious phone calls with people like Jack Eagle, who was...
A wonderful name in the whole field of study abroad after World War II.
Oh, indeed, yeah. I was a founder of CIEE.
Mm-hmm.
I even had a meeting with William Fulbright, who was the chair of CIEE, who gave me, whose blessing was necessary, and Robert Lappin. And the process of recruitment took forever. And I'm not exaggerating, I think it was 9 months.
Oh my goodness. And you were in the UK?
Yes, and I was still working in the BBC trying to teach American Lit. So anyway, that's what happened, and I joined CIEE in the Exchanges division, not really study abroad.
So you stayed in London?
Yes, yeah.
And opened an office there for that?
I did, yeah. I opened an office at the British Council.
Mm-hmm.
It was a very small office. And that's how I got into it.
So, exchanges, what did that mean at that point in time?
It was the area, historically, international education is kind of interesting, because what we now see is study abroad and for credit mobility and all the rest of it. But there's a whole other area, which is really work and travel. That kind of
That's right, which CIEE really specialized in.
Yeah, and non-credit activity. Right. So the JET I managed the JET program in Japan, for example,
right.
From Europe to Japan. So it was all those things that we think of as international educational mobility that weren't for credit and weren't necessarily for students.
Right.
I did that for some years, then went into the mainstream of study abroad at Syracuse and other places.
At Syracuse?
Yes.
And what did you do with them?
I ran I was for 2 years. I only lasted 2 years because we came to a mutual understanding that we couldn't work together.
You do want to remember it's videotape.
I do. And I love them. And they're good friends, and we left on but it taught me something, that a big division in this field is between the private sector and the universities. And by temperament, I wasn't very good at being patient. And in the private sector, you could be quick.
You know what? And I have experienced both.
Yes.
So I understand what you're saying. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Because it's something, there's both a tension that started then, there was suspicion of the private sector,
Yeah.
and even nonprofit. But at the same time, it is something that's in many ways merged.
To a degree, but
Still tension.
I still think there is. And, if I think now, at Kappa or anywhere else I've been in the private sector, if I have an idea in January, I need the approval at most of 1 or 2 people, and I can have it up and running by April.
Right.
At Syracuse, and I'm not blaming Syracuse.
All universities,
all universities,
internationally, domestically.
There was a kind of Kafka thing called what was it called now? The risk management department.
Oh.
And nothing I ever submitted ever came back.
They took no risk.
It was like dead letters, Gogol,
Right.
And I just, in the end, thought, this isn't for me. I just found it, I was too impatient and too irritable.
Right.
And grumpy.
Right. And so, from Syracuse?
Then I went back to CIE. I was
And that's, I think, when we worked together.
Yes. Then I went back
In the
to
90s.
the academic department.
Yeah.
And was dubbed by my then boss the second coming, which I thought was rather beatific. I arose as and was there as the coordinator of the Anglophone world, which is one of the more ridiculous jobs, because it ran from Northern Ireland to New Zealand was my area. So I did a fair bit of travelling.
Wow.
But it was it was much more mainstream study.
And what kind of things? I mean, what was CIE doing then that you were involved in?
I was, I got injunctions, go close Australia. That was one of the more interesting
Oh, I
things.
actually remember that one.
Because at that point I closed 41 programs. I was
Right.
going nuts, Developed Africa, developed India, which was very interesting for me. I think the program still exists, but I started a Hyderabad program for CIE. And started to think at that point about how we talked about things and the way, the kind of discourse that was running through study abroad and international ed. And maybe that's where in latter years I've sort of focused as an annoying Jeremiah moaning at the way we talk about things.
Actually, I think it's something that you're known for, both to challenge concepts like global citizenship, and all concepts need to be challenged. It's not that they don't have some inherent value, but they always have inherent issues. So I think you're very well known for that. And you're also a man who's committed to research, publication, exploring ideas, and that's a contribution I think you make today.
Well, I hope so, because one of the things that I think, one of the tensions in this field, and it's right, I'm not criticizing anyone, is that we juggle 2 hats. We're administrators and we're educators.
Right.
And something I've seen is that we have become much better administrators. Worrying about how we do things, right and proper, health and safety. And I started, people took huge risks. Teaching groups in a pub, I did it myself, for Lewis and Clark 1,000 years ago. And halfway through the program, somebody said, "Did they have insurance?" And we said, "I don't know, do they?" So none of that happens.
No.
So we've become very focused, and it's right on how. How do we get underrepresented students? How do we grow numbers? How do we keep students fit and well? Blah blah. What we haven't been as good at is asking why, and looking at the agenda, the educational agenda. So that's what I've tried to do.
You have, and you've done it very well. And I actually want to go back a little bit because I do consulting with an organization which you really helped to move forward, the Foundation for International Education. So let's just go to the trajectory of your career and then to this question that you just raised about why we're doing things and how it's changed.
What's
so you went to FIE from CIEE? I get lost in initials.
Yes. And I was the president for 7 years at FIE, which I enjoyed. The debate, do you want me to say something about the why, what that meant?
And that brings you to Kappa. So that's your career trajectory,
yes,
which has been primarily through the non-institutional side,
yes,
the non-university side,
yes,
which is an area, as we noted, that has made enormous contributions, different from universities, where there are great partnerships today between universities, but there's also tension. And we may want to interweave that discussion as we talk about the why. So you're now at a point, having developed programs, built programs, changed programs, expanded the idea of everything from work and volunteer to academic programs to the structure around it, of saying, okay, why have we done it all? And so, yes, I'd like you to talk about that. What are we doing and why are we doing it?
Why have we done it in that way is one of the questions. You know, I focused on things that, I mean, I think they're mistakes. It sounds terribly arrogant to say this, and I don't mean it in an arrogant way, but like the focus on culture. This field is now preoccupied with the notion that what we do is cross-cultural, intercultural, all of that. And that's really based, if you think about it long enough, it's based on a misunderstanding of what we do, because we don't do that. What we do actually is take students from one country to another. And that may or may not involve crossing cultures, especially now that there's a growing kind of interaction and I say uniformity, but connection between young people across the world, for example. You know, the idea that we should focus on intercultural studies makes the mistake of assuming that countries and cultures align.
Right.
Now, there is a thing called intercultural studies. It may best be done at home. It may not be an international agenda, but it's not the core of what we do. I think we need to shift focus away from the kind of anodyne conversations about culture to really look at what makes countries, and that's politics, history, war, lies, deceit, conflict. This is how countries are made. They're not natural.
Sounds like Shakespeare.
But there's a historical reason for that. You knew Bill Alloway, I'm sure.
He was one of the interviews for the first generation.
I'm sure he was. And he was the founder of EPA in the 60s.
Which is University of California.
And he always said, and Bill, you know, was in older than me, rest his soul, and he said, if you want to understand why this field keeps talking about culture, you have to go back to Joe McCarthy. He said, this field stumbled into existence when subjects like international politics, national identities were very dangerous conversations unless you were against everything. That was fine. So he said this field started to grow on campuses when there was this kind of McCarthyite environment, and it became safer and easier to talk about culture. And he said we've never got out from under that.
That's really interesting.
So that's, you know, one of the things I've driven Kappa in is in the direction of moving away from that discourse. So we say, what are our objectives? To study urbanization, globalization, social dynamics. We don't talk about intercultural. You know, I have no objection.
So I'm going to be the devil's advocate.
Yes.
How do you talk about urbanization, globalization, the last thing that you said, without having intercultural be a part of it? It seems to me inherently a part of it.
I don't. Well, how? Well, because
how can you be global and not intercultural? In the sense, I don't mean perfect intercultural behavior. I mean, isn't globalization an intercultural challenge?
No, it's a geopolitical challenge.
But isn't that also intercultural? What is it? Okay, define intercultural.
Well, that's an issue. If you use cultural, and I always argue this with Darla, bless her, I hope you've interviewed her. If you use cultural to include everything that humans do, which we do in our field, then it loses specificity. It becomes a term so vague as not to mean anything. I learned something recently. I went through the forum, Education Abroad titles, you could do it at this conference, and pulled out things like cultural encounter and try and deconstruct them. And in fact, the term is much more meaningful if you just remove the word culture. Encounter is a richer potential than cultural encounter. What does that mean? Tea at the National Gallery?
So you think in terms of high culture? Not
I think
in
that's
terms-
the only useful way to use it, unless you're genuinely an anthropologist, because what we do is use it badly. We use it to mean everything. So it doesn't mean anything.
I see what you're saying. Okay.
So, you know, and the other thing it does, I'm going to roll here, I'll shut up.
No, you're not supposed to.
Hi. The other thing it does is actually reactionary. It's politically reactionary to focus on intercultural. Because what you are saying, if you dig into it deeply enough, is that culture is an obstruction, is a barrier, and we have to teach students to cross this, to cross the barrier between this culture and that culture, which actually is drawing attention to, is assuming that the things that divide humanity are more important than the things that unite humanity. And actually, I don't believe that. I believe in cosmopolitanism and internationalism, and I think that's the wrong focus. I think if you start with, we have more things in common than we do that divide us, that focus begins to lose sense and starts to sound parochial. It starts to sound reactionary. Reactionary is too strong. I called Mick van der Berg a reactionary at a cocktail party, and luckily we both had enough to drink for it not to be offensive.
And you continue to drink.
Oh yes,
Okay.
It's an old friend. But you know, that's the kind of thing I've tried to think about. And you know, I don't, this is my opinion, and you put it strongly because you're actually asking people to question basic orthodoxy. And
Of our field,
of
of our
field.
profession.
Yeah.
So what does this mean in terms of not just Kappa, but American universities, anybody's activities, both in terms of inbound and outbound student populations? What does it mean on a practical level?
On a very practical level, I think it shouldn't draw us to, I mean, if I have my way, which I won't, draw us to be more precise and careful when we talk about student learning objectives.
And outcomes?
Outcomes isn't, I have an issue about outcomes.
We'll go to that
Yeah.
too, because that's a huge issue today.
Okay, student learning, if you like, outcomes and objectives.
No, you talk about objectives first.
Objectives need to be concrete and specific and verifiable,
Okay.
and not based on the illusion that we're doing something we're not doing.
Yeah.
You know, global citizenship,
right.
I've written about, I want to go about that. But you know, stuff like the whole rhetoric of transformation, with, you know, this idea of changing your life, which is a terrible notion. Every time I hear students say study abroad, change your life, I don't blame the student, I blame the teacher for letting them say that. Because study abroad didn't change their life. They changed their lives by studying abroad. Very different statement. Study abroad changed my life in the passive voice does two things. It implies that, the first thing it does is imply that there's a place called abroad. A non-defined location which is better than here, which is very...
Which is better?
Yes, because you go abroad to change your life is the thing, is the implication. And by
No, I don't think so. Again, I'm going to be the devil's advocate. I think what they're saying, and I mean, and you can tell me I'm wrong because you always do, is that being abroad changed them in ways they never anticipated because they began to see things in a different way.
Well, I would challenge that, because I challenge the order, not the concept, and I don't, you know, I think what we do can be transformational. I don't think we should put that as an objective, because that's in, you know, priests, transformational things are the role of priests and prophets. You know, baptism is supposed to, death is transformational, that's for sure. But I would say that in the statement, study abroad changed my life, or there is a kind of passivity that implies that by going abroad, you will necessarily experience new things. Well, you won't. You can go abroad.
Oh, I agree with you on that.
Absolutely nothing can happen. So if you change the voice, it's a different statement. I don't know quite, how did we get here?
How did we get here? Because you're always thinking outside the box and presenting it well. And so, what again does that mean for practical education? What do you do in study abroad then, since we're talking about that? What do you do? And what would you think about doing on a domestic campus for the 97% of the students who never go abroad?
There's two questions. One thing I would certainly do is define our objectives more specifically.
Okay.
In academic terms, you know, in globalization, urbanization, whatever you want to teach. Avoid the kind of soft-edged stuff. And then I would, as we do, promote ourselves more realistically.
And what does that mean?
It means you do not tell students we're going to transform you. It means, because if you say that to a student, they go to Spain and they come back and say, didn't transform my life, but I improved my Spanish. They've failed in some kind of...
Well, and I will say that I've worked and taught in countries where the assumption is people will come back more liberal. I have seen people come back to become President George Bush II's advisors who were on the programs I worked with. That was not more liberal. Not saying it's right or wrong, the outcomes are not the same.
Absolutely, you can't predict them. It's important to recognize that. The other thing about this is I think it's actually intrinsically disrespectful of America. People don't think about this. As if you can change your life by going to another place. Well, you can change your life in Des Moines, Iowa. That's internal, that's to do with you.
I know. I understand what you're saying, Michael. And I understand the precision of language, and I share your concern about pop terms that come up in our whole professional field and get used and then disappear. But for a while, they define everything. Last summer, by chance, I'm going to use a personal example, because I happened to be in Israel when the war started. I woke up with mortar shells a mile away from me. I ran for cover. I did all the things people do. I'd never been in a war zone. I would have to say it transformed my understanding of a number of things.
Absolutely.
So I would use that word.
Well, I wouldn't challenge that. What I would say is that certainly, like any other educational experience, can be transformative. But you don't propose, it's not your part of your marketing, if you like, to tell students we will transform you.
I see what you're saying.
Because that's way over inflated.
I see what you're saying. You're saying it's not our job. It's their job to discover if that occurs.
If it occurs, and if it doesn't occur, they haven't failed. I like what Stanley Fish said. Well, Stanley Fish said our job is to take, about higher education, about all education, is to take students from relative ignorance to relative knowledge, and that's the most you can promise.
Now, yes.
Whatever else happens may or may not happen, but that's their business.
Right.
And I agree with that.
And it's very interesting. I mean, as marketing, it's very interesting, because what you're basically saying to the student, we give you this opportunity, you do with it as you choose.
Absolutely. And I don't think that's bad marketing. We've done pretty well saying that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Although, to tell you the truth, I fight our own marketing people because they can money. But what the consequence of this would be, I think, is that our endeavours might then get some kind of parity of esteem on campuses with other academic endeavours. Because like it or not, there are still plenty of people on US campuses who think that what we do is frippery. Nobody hates it, but it's
If they get a chance to go, it's great, but it doesn't count toward tenure, it doesn't count toward promotion.
It certainly doesn't. And we might, if we were to do this consistently, to demonstrate that we are actually thinking about what we do, whether we agree or disagree with what I think. I don't think everybody should agree with that stuff. That will raise our status.
Right.
In the long run, that's got to be where we want to be.
Right. So, as you have undertaken the trajectory of your own career, can you give examples of how you implemented it in different organizations and why you got to this point?
Well, certainly on a really rather flippant level, I have scared everybody in my current organisation. So nowhere will you find us talk about, I think nowhere, there could be little pockets of resistance. So we don't talk about intercultural studies. There are things we don't talk about that other organisations do. And I think we've driven ourselves into being very precise about what we want to teach students.
And is this different from 30 years ago, 40 years ago? Very different. And do you find that today you can, but then you couldn't? Or then you wouldn't even have understood?
I wouldn't have thought about it so much then.
Yeah.
I think you evolve in your thinking. And my problem is I'm a kind of counter-thinker.
Yeah.
And something that's happened in our field, which I don't object to, going back to, I think you and I came into this field a bit by accident. And people,
both of us were academics in different ways.
Yeah, and people came into this field, all sorts of different backgrounds. And there was no profession. And the fact that there's a profession now, which I have no objection to, believe me. You know, that people do doctorates in the field of international education, do MAs, all of that's good, except that it's kind of embedded in orthodoxy there. So there are several things that...
Depends on what you do and where you do it.
Yes, it does, and I don't want to criticise that. But the professionalisation of any endeavour leads to orthodoxies.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose, you know, I've been disappointed in a sense that about the orthodoxies that have emerged. Because I don't think they're that thoughtful.
Right. So, where would you see our profession going, and how do we get there?
I think we have a little problem, actually. We are stuck at numbers-wise. We've been stuck
forever.
Yeah.
We're still 3% of the American undergraduate population if you look at just that.
And you know, Rolf Hoffmann,
Yes.
my German friend, is even a bigger nuisance than I am.
And say who he is for people.
He's the head of the German Fulbright. I don't know his exact title, but he draws graphs that says, all right, US higher education's grown like this, US study abroad's grown like this, there's no growth.
Same
in
percentage.
study abroad.
Yeah, same percentage.
I don't know if he's correct, I can't.
He is correct, I've done the
look
research.
at it. Yeah. So we have a problem. And I think to my mind, the idea of 1 million, you can say that rhetoric. You know, I have nothing against IIE and the Simon Act and all of that, which nothing ever happened as a consequence of. The IIE's, what is it, 1 million, global million, and all that. I think it's good because people start talking. But it's not going to happen unless you make some root and branch changes.
Right.
And that change, I think, and it's just me, has to be in terms of credibility. It has to be in terms of establishing your credibility and actually doing something about social justice and diversity as well. Because the other thing one of the things I've been thinking about is the way that we get all fuzzy and warm because we create short-term programs for underrepresented students. And when you start to think about that, you think, well, this is all, I did this overstating, but it's a form of discrimination. And, you know, social justice should be you create opportunities for everybody that are equal. And we're still not quite doing that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a kind of concern. Where we'll be, I don't know. This is a good activity and there are good people attached to it, so I don't have an Armageddon view of the world. You know, one thing about educators, bless you, is that we all have, and you have to resist it, a kind of Eden thing, which is, I always think it was the Eden complex, that then it was better in the past, whenever then was, than it is now. Socrates had it. Every educator for thousands of years has said these students, this situation, these students are not as good as we were.
Right.
I don't think it's true. I think things are, you know, when I think back to my generation of students, God help us, I don't know how we lived through it, you know. In the 60s, moving on.
Yes,
from this.
that's okay, I remember too.
Moving on from this. So I'm quite optimistic. I just think we need to become more than just good people. We need to become relevant people. And that I'm not sure we're there yet.
And is that relevancy within higher education institutions? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, eventually. Ultimately, that's where it has to come from. You know, I have great respect for the US higher education and the whole liberal arts tradition. And without the support of that, nothing's going to happen. You know, our organisation is deeply embedded in partnerships. I mean, to the degree where we really don't get individual students. Many of them are. Many organizations are.
Yeah. FIE and CIE also,
yeah,
although not the same way.
No. But it gives you, it's your rationale. You know, you're serving institutions. Institutions are going to go on a lot longer than the individual student.
Right.
So to be relevant to their curriculum and their aspirations is crucial for us.
And do you see efforts in that direction? I would say I see those efforts.
Yeah.
But you're saying they're sometimes quite misguided still. Maybe on both sides.
I think so. You know, the truth is that universities are more conservative than we are. Every university we work with is more conservative than we are.
Oh, of course. Yes,
You know,
that's the private public. Or
yeah.
not private public, but the private The non-institutional side
Yeah.
of international education. It's
Well,
always that case.
it's even more with us because historically, most of campus partners are large state institutions, not the private
Right.
universities, which
Yeah.
is a bit different from FIA, was a different tension. It may have changed
Yeah.
since my day. So, you, in a sense, you have to lead the discussion.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So I have one last question, and maybe it's not fair to ask you,
Please ask.
but I will anyway. And that is, how are things going in Europe with international education as opposed to the US? Do you see similarities in issues, changes?
That's a really good question. And I think, you have to start from the key difference is that in Europe, this is a government-down activity.
Right.
International education is a strategic plan. Bologna, Erasmus, these are strategic initiatives. In the US, for good and ill, that has problems. For good and ill in the US, it's a much more fractured, very private set of activities, so it doesn't have the cohesion here. I think there are European projects which I think are wonderful, and I think Bologna, when you look back on Bologna, it's the single largest voluntary social experiment that anybody has happened in history.
That's a great way to describe it.
Voluntary enrollment to a scheme that nobody had to do.
Right.
And of course, who wrote that. The first version was written by Guy Ho, who was my boss at AIEA.
Oh my gosh.
On a piece of yellow paper and a pencil.
I know Guy. I remember him quite well.
I should have stolen him. He's worth $1 million. Anyway, I see him very often. Beside the point. So it was a great visionary step, which a lot of people have bought into. Doesn't mean it hasn't had its problems. The other thing I think, bless you,
I'm sorry.
the thing that's coming out of Europe now and is, in fact, in a mini way, has governed what we've done internally at capitalism, very boring, is the tuning project. Is very important.
Yes. Can you explain that?
Yeah, essentially on a macro scale, the European, the EU has said, I should say, the European Commission has said, we should try and align, so a 3-year degree in Bulgaria and compared with a 3-year degree in France in history, for example, in the 3rd year there should be some level of transparency in comparison. There should be at least transparent. The differences should be transparent.
Right.
So in a way it makes alignment much more obvious and clear.
Right.
And on a minor scale, that's what we've done. We've looked at, we have 8 centres and we've looked at courses that we teach. And even on a minor scale, it's a huge project.
Yes, it is, I know.
Across Europe. And then now some American institutions have become very interested.
That's right.
So this is another great initiative. There are still problems though, and there are pockets of problems, and my country is a huge problem because we're not really participants in Erasmus for all sorts of reasons. They're rather complicated. So student mobility in Europe has left some people out, and you need to find some other ways to do things. But I don't think one is necessarily better than the other. There was a session yesterday that said that was a bit naive because it was arguing that European programs, international programs are much better because they were so multifaceted. And they are, this is true. They involve faculty, they involve all sorts of tuning and all the rest of it. But they're not without their problems either. So, I think it's good to have 2 different systems. The problem is that they don't always mesh, but...
I have one last question about
Please.
Europe, and that is the concept of intercultural. Is that still a part of it, or is that really disappeared in the realities of the EU and how to manage all of this?
I think there are intercultural realities. I've never denied that.
Okay.
But they don't align with countries. That's my point.
Okay.
So, is there a difference between young and old in Bulgaria? For sure. Is there a difference between young and old across Europe? Maybe. Is there a difference between the young of Ireland and Finland that's huge? I don't think so. There might be a linguistic barrier, but then not actually to Finland.
And that could also be part of the digital age.
Yes. And you look at the ways...
Which is changing the concepts of intercultural. You're absolutely
Look at icons. You look at... I was on the Great Wall. I wrote about this recently. Great Wall of China. You can buy a mug with a Mona Lisa on it and a tea towel with Mickey Mouse. Completely decultured. These are icons that have lost all sorts of culture, obtained another meaning that has nothing to do with culture. That's to do with commercialization and globalization.
Yeah.
So, I never want to say you can't do intercultural studies. I just think it's peripheral to education abroad. It may or may not matter.
I think that's a great way to end this discussion because it ends it with who you are, which is a person who challenges existing ideas, and that's always an important role to play.
Draw a veil over this whole unpleasant experience. I'm joking.
And he's a person we've all learned to tolerate very well in our family. And on that note, I would like very much to thank my friend Dr. Michael Woolf for being a part of this digital archive series. And he's not really old enough to call it an archive yet, but he's getting there.
Yeah, I'm getting there. Thank you, Joan.